You're tuned in to the MtG Cable cast, where they cover Magic, the Gathering Finance. All right? You don't know about it? You're tuned in right now and get ready to learn some shit. Buckle your seat belts and light a blunt and get ready for the MtG Cable cast. Starring Reptar and Thirsty, them onion head motherfuckers.
All right, guys, welcome to the newest episode of the Cabal Cast. This one's kind of interesting, I think.
Yeah.
So we're basically taking a look at what makes a healthy format. From a gameplay perspective, from a financial perspective, what does it look like throughout the history of Magic, and what really makes some of the best formats from a finance perspective? Because, ban lists happen, people don't play formats because they get stale, whatever the case may be. So, things can change. And obviously most people, when they get into Magic, what you're supposed to do is you learn Limited first. Back when competitive play happened, it wasn't EDH. But after Limited, you got into Standard.
Yes.
So I have two really good Standard formats that I liked a lot.
Yeah.
One was the Lorwyn era Standard, where you had Fairies, 5-color control, and Kithkin.
Mm-hmm.
So this format is unique because it was not good from a gameplay perspective. It was really bad.
Yeah, it was miserable.
As someone who played Mono Fairies and loved every minute of it, that format was garbage. Interesting side note about that format, Saito top-8'd a Legacy event in Japan with Standard Kithkin. Anybody can do it. But the thing was, this era was very financially healthy. We just had Planeswalkers for the first time ever. We just got them. You had a control deck that existed that somehow managed to add 4 of any color on turn 4.
And this
because
is,
of the...
for people who are wondering, the Cruel control list. This is Gabe Nassif's list from that Nationals or whatever.
Best top deck ever. Yeah. Just arranges his mana and then, got it.
Cruel.
But there were really only 2 viable archetypes, and it was Fairies and 5-color control.
Yep.
Kithkin was there. Elves was there. They just didn't really matter. It wasn't even a rock, paper, scissors format. It was just rock. And that was basically it. And the reason this was good financially was because in addition to having these Planeswalkers out here, the aesthetic was good, the art was good, the tribes were good. People loved these cards.
It was super evocative.
It was. It was great, and people wanted them.
Yeah.
And they wanted to play with them. They wanted to collect them, whatever the case was. This was back in the day when you could show up for a 200-person PTQ. Like it was nothing. But the big thing was, again, it may have been financially healthy because you had staples that were 4-ofs in decks that were in the $20 to $30 range in a rare slot.
Yes.
Obviously, this is also before the advent of Mythic Rarity, which is a very important line to draw when talking about eras of formats. Because Mythic Rarity did change things financially.
Mm-hmm.
But this was before that time, and it was very good.
Yes.
Decks were still around $500, but that was it. That was the deck. It wasn't a $2,000 behemoth or anything like that. You didn't have chase versions of cards outside of foils. You had Thoughtseize, you had Una's...
Cryptic Command, you had...
Yeah, Cryptic, Scion of Una,
Bitter Blossom.
Bitter Blossom. Unmake was a card that people played. And the other standard format that I go to, and this is the one that I give everyone as an example of what makes a good standard,
All right, hit me.
is RTR. So RTR standard was great because we had a shit ton of mana fixing because of the Shocklands, but we didn't have fetches.
Not yet.
So you couldn't be super greedy.
Oh, you know what you actually had too? This was a call. Shocks as a called shot in Return to Rav came because Farseek was in the core set prior. That's also really big on this.
Yep.
In this.
And the thing that was great about this was there were literally 8 to 9 viable tier 1 archetypes in this metagame. And it was great because that actually suppressed prices. Because there wasn't a concentration of 2 or 3 decks that you see in some of the later standard sets with mythic rares, which RTR had. The example I go to is Kaladesh, where Aetherworks Marvel was like 60% of the meta share.
Yeah.
So that stuff was really expensive. That wasn't the case with RTR. You had, your Azorius control, you had your Jund list, your Gruul. There was a ton of stuff there that you could do. And I remember Supreme Verdict being like the chase card, or not Supreme Verdict, sorry, Sphinx's Revelation being the chase card at $25.
Mm-hmm.
Deathrite was a $10 to $15 card because it was in 2 to 3 different decks, just because it was good.
Yes.
And that to me is what really looks like a healthy financial format. It's not that there's, 2 to 3 archetypes and staples are concentrated. It's the gameplay is so good that it suppresses prices across the board because there's not a homogenization of what's viable. There's a bunch of different archetypes out there.
Yeah.
And, this was the first time where we started seeing, RTR into Innistrad. Obviously, we had Snapcaster Mage, Geist of Saint Traft, all these things that just from a design perspective kind of signaled a shift in the way that Magic was going. But the format was really good because whereas during Lorwyn, you could get a, tier 1 deck for 500, they were like $300 in RTR. And there were 10 of them. It was just a really good time because you have a lot of liquidity, but you also have affordability.
Yeah.
It's not like what happens a lot of times in Legacy where people talk about being priced out or EDH being pay to win because you've got to buy these expensive cards or whatever. It wasn't like that at all. It was literally, I'm going to give you 15 for your Cryptic in Lorwyn. I'm going to give you 15 to 17 for your Sphinx's Rev. I'll sell it tomorrow, if not an hour later, for $20 to $25 and be fine with that. And it was just this really cool time where you had basically, in some ways, and your recollection may be different, almost the advent of backpacking started then. And as a mass thing, it wasn't just something that Ogre did. It was people would go around because all of these cards were liquid.
Yep.
All of these cards had value. We started to see a homogenization of prices and locale and everything. It was really, really cool. And to me, and I'll talk about some other formats later, financially, that is the best Standard has ever been. Ever. Not particularly close. It was insane. And it was good because every pack you opened had something playable in it that had value. It was a banger. It was great.
The Standard format that I look at is more of an era. It's from Cons to Battle for Zendikar. I think for me, as from a playability standpoint in terms of Standard and financially, this is one of the best to look at, despite the fact that I probably actually enjoyed Onslaught Mirrodin Standard a little bit more because there was a lot more involved from play patterns in that era. But this Cons to Battle for Zendikar has very similar traits to the Standard environments you're looking at in regards to the fact that every pack you opened was impactful. Yep. There was going to be something inside that you can make use of because there was so much to be doing, and it wasn't at that point just Standard like Lorwyn. It played more into Commander like Return to Rav started to do because the format had just been supported by WotC, and we started to see a shift in Innistrad, the block before Return to Rav, of more Commander focused cards that were still playable in Standard, like Crater of Behemoth comes from that set, for instance. And in Cons through Battle, we saw the same stuff. You look at, there's the fetch lands, there's Ugin, the Spirit Dragon, there's the Dragon lands. Yep, that come from across the block. We had Sidisi, both versions. We had Sarkhan, Dragon Speaker, etc. Now, the reason I picked this as an era is because this formats that we're talking about actually bookend one that I think was really bad in Theros because Devotion narrowed everything down so much. It was basically mono blue, mono black, or the Gruul monsters list, whatever you want to call it, with Polychronos and Stormbreath Dragon.
Yep.
And so we're looking at another really vibrant format that lasted for a fairly long time, but kind of necessitated a little bit of a cushion coming out of Theros. So the metagames were similar for the entire timeline from Cons through Battle, but they were vibrant, saw nuanced variation in lists from event to event. There are meaningful best decks at each flagpole Pro Tour, and each one of those Pro Tours saw a different meta. The Star City circuit was in full swing, and it brought with it a showcase of talent that further altered local and larger metagames and showcased new and interesting strategies, which kept the format continuously changing.
Yep.
And I have, I'll put these in the show notes, the links to Pro Tour Battle for Zendikar, Pro Tour Dragons of Tarkir, and Pro Tour Origins, where you can actually see the metagame from Cons kind of move through to Origins. Yep. I skipped Fate Reforged because that was a modern Pro Tour, so duh. And Pro Tour Kaladesh was rather like squirrely and kind of inbred as it contained Theros and the Devotion mechanic, though we did see Jeskai and Abzan decks start to loom large, and those two will kind of continue on. Blue-black Control existed for a while until rotation, but eventually fell out in favor of Sidisi Whip, which was a Sultai control deck.
And it was really good.
It was really
good. It lacked a Siege Rhino.
Yes. And there was 100%. There was the mono red list that played Sarkhan. There was a green red deck that you could that played Surrak, I believe, and made Wild Slash a really good card. And so there was just a lot to be doing in this format. Financially, this was a really easy to palette time in Standard because the pressure was put in the correct place. Like you were saying, Planeswalkers had hype and cost a bunch, and they showed up and showed out as expected. Financially, nothing was too extravagant or difficult to manage. It was all kind of as expected. Ugin might have been the only real outlier here, but that's because it made Modern Impact immediately and fell into Tron, which was doing really well at the time. But all of that changed when Origins hit, and with it came Jace Vryn's Prodigy, and so things kind of change here. This card definitely did show up, and it definitely did show out, and its price was definitely reflective of that. Upwards of almost $100, like somewhere around $80 for a really long time.
Yeah.
And along with Jace Vryn's Prodigy came collateral pressure to the fetch lands and spells like Dig Through Time that took advantage of flush graveyards. The Battle for Zendikar, quote, Tango lands had an unnecessary price point because they were fetchable and ally colored, which further exacerbated the issue. And boy, was Standard really expensive for a time. And we're talking like maybe $600 to $700 for any deck with Jace Vryn's Prodigy or Gideon Ally of Zendikar.
Yeah.
So for a while, you just kind of floated through on this really great Standard where everything kind of cost a fair and moderate amount. Everything was super liquid, like you were talking about. We had I did mention Sidisi Whip that played Whip of Erebus from Theros Block before that, so the gods were still moving pretty quickly. People were cracking packs for fetch lands in all three sets, so those were extremely liquid. All the Planeswalkers from the set, again, highly liquid. Most of the rares and the high-impact Mythics. Mythics, highly liquid. This is a very fun format to play and trade in, to backpack in. It was just a really good time overall. And the further we move through Battle for Zendikar set, we move into a more homogenized format where things get a lot more boring and Standard becomes a little less palatable because of that. We kind of settle on another like mono green meta for a while with focusing on Gideon Ally of Zendikar as a premier card in the format, adding Nissa, the 3-drop Nissa over time, and a bunch of vehicles alongside that. And it just kind of shrinks away the importance that was the cons format overall. So for me, when I think back Standard environments that I played that were really good to transact in, that is one of them. RTR was another. I was doing a ton of backpacking for the same reason. Everything was super liquid from Innistrad Block and RTR. People just came out to play events, and binders were just easy to open and get into. Everybody was looking for everything, it felt like, and that was a super good Standard environment as well.
Yeah.
I
loved that era because it was, like you said, it was an era of just solid Standard for an extended period of time. Say what you will about Coco, everybody knows my feelings on the card. I don't know how many times I've picked it at this point. Siege Rhino was great. It was the last time I remember Wizards designing multiple sets in a row incredibly well.
Yeah, the only problem was Fate Reforged in the long run. A lot of people didn't like that set, but it has kind of grown over time. We were trying that summer at Anime Expo. We were selling our Fate Reforged boxes at cost because we didn't want to fly them home. But at that point, I believe we'd hit battle. Like something had happened in the Standard environment and it just soured, and that set was financially the worst set to open. So people just kind of balked. But moving on, we're going to take a look at Modern next.
Yeah, and this was kind of interesting to me. It's more of an abstract thing. So when the Modern format was announced, they just said, hey, this is what it is. Top stand. That was it. That was all they said.
Well, they came up with the extended ban list is the Modern ban list, so not to be pedantic, here's Stoneforge Mystic, Jace Mind Sculptor, GT.
That was a little later, but when it was fresh, before that first Pro Tour, before, was it Blazing Shoal?
Yes.
Just destroyed Progenitus with Infect everything. That was disgusting. Before that happened, legitimately, playtesting that format with friends was the most fun I've ever had. 12 posts from that time period. It drew all the cards, it countered all the spells, it took all the turns. Because you had your 12 posts, you had ramp spells, you had Jace the Mind Sculptor, Spell Burst, the buyback counter spell from Time Spiral,
Oh yeah,
and
Emrakul.
And then you had the Tribal Zoo, where you just had Tribal Flames and Zoo because you had fetches and shocks. Well, you had shocks, not fetches at the time.
Oh yeah.
And Deathrite was in the format, and Jund ran Deathrite and Noble Hierarch? What?
Lingering Souls is a powerful card.
Yeah, it was just a lot of fun. And the reason that was financially interesting was because that was the last time I remember something big happening in Magic before TCG Player kind of took over and exploded and became the place where everything went for Magic.
Okay.
So there was a lot of opportunity in that. Because if you were testing with friends, if you were paying attention on message boards, because the Source and Salvation obviously exploded at the time with people playtesting this, it gave you a lot of opportunity to kind of get a leg up on what was going on, not just in the game, but also financially. Because you had people talking about, oh, these are the decks I'm playtesting, these are doing really well. You know, you've got people that are playtesting at, mana drains with like Reduke and everyone. And it was really cool because to me, that's kind of when speculation took off personally.
Okay, yeah.
When I started to be like, all right, well, if this happens, what kind of cards stand to benefit from it? And that was the era where I really kind of wet my teeth with it before that first Pro Tour when the metagame kind of coalesced into what it would become. Mm-hmm. And there was just that opportunity and that newness to it that had so many people excited for it. And you had people that would like literally run in, hey, I need 4 breeding pools and 2 watery graves for this build I'm trying. And again, everything was liquid. But with it being an Eternal format, it was incredibly interesting because that's when I remember foils exploding, was when they announced Modern and when Modern started to take over. And you started to see what is kind of, for a long time, was the economic norm in Magic, was foils were just insane.
Yeah.
They were a lot more valuable. They were not incredibly liquid, but they were certainly liquid. And you also had, for the first time, a big foreign market in foils and stuff like that. So if you were able to get some of those foreign foils affordably, you could potentially make a ton of money on them. And it was just a time when I remember a shit ton of opportunity existing, not just financially, but also in terms of gameplay, because nobody really knew. And it was the hybrid time between where we are now, where all of the information is available immediately right away.
Yep.
And the before times where your deck lists were checking Inquest and Scry. And that was it.
Yeah.
And it was just a really unique moment in Magic history that was both good financially for the game and good gameplay for the game. And, it's kind of sad Modern was a necessity because personally, I fucking loved Extended, which
we'll talk
great.
about a bit later. Yeah. For me, looking at the Modern format, I come at this a little bit later when I'm looking at the format as to the version that I like the most. For reference, the era that you're talking about is basically around I want to say like late Q2 of 2011. When you look at the ban restricted list, Modern sees its first bans in August of 2011 when it becomes a sanctioned format. And September, it sees bannings from the Pro Tour that you referenced, Pro Tour Philly, the first Modern Pro Tour. Then we hit 2012, and there is 1 ban in Modern, sum total. Valakut is banned in Modern. Then in 2013, we see Bloodbraid Elf and a targeted Storm ban that is unnecessary in Seething Song, as well as Second Sunrise because that deck was rancid.
That was bad.
Yeah. Then in 2014, in February, Deathrite Shaman is banned.
Yep.
So about 2.5 years after the era that you're talking about is where I come in. And for me, basically, right around Deathrite Shaman banning is where I begin to enjoy Modern. Because Deathrite Shaman wrought havoc on the diversity of the metagame. It really kind of turned it into this like Deathrite Shaman soup. And an example of what Deathrite Shaman did to the format was When you look at Burn, which is traditionally a mono red or Boros list, depending on the state of the format overall, Burn actually had to go Rakdos to play Deathrite Shaman for inevitability, eating their own cards out of their graveyard. And then also the card Bump in the Night, which is like Lightning Bolt on the front at sorcery speed, and then you could flash it back for 8 or something like that. And with the banning of Deathrite Shaman, that freed up deck design space, it unlocked the format, and we saw quickly the rise of Birthing Pod and Splinter Twin, with Storm and various control shells, Jund and Tron still carving away at the format. And to kind of see what I mean, I'm going to bring up real quick. This is Grand Prix Detroit, September 15th.
Yep.
The winner is Josh McClain on Birthing Pod. He beats Reed Duke, who is on Jund. The third seed is Ben Moore on Jund. The fourth seed is Ben Stark on Jund. The fifth seed is Adam Jansen on Jund. The sixth seed is Alex Magelton on Affinity. Then in 7th and 8th, we have Marcialo Freeman and Willie Edel on The Rock. That is 7 base Golgari decks in a top 8. And that is, again, September. Then we see the Deathrite Shaman banning, and we come back and we take a look at Grand Prix Richmond, which was in March, so a month after the Deathrite Shaman ban. And Brian Liu wins with Birthing Pod, but after that we see Affinity. Project Malira is another Birthing Pod list, but it's much more mid-range based. It's
a value deck rather than a combo list.
Yes, it plays Siege Rhino. Then Ben Friedman, same thing, the Siege Rhino list. Twin, Project Malira, Josh McClain again. I know he's on Siege Rhino. LSV on Siege Rhino. Twin, Affinity, Scape Shift, Twin, Fairies. Even if we extend out the top 8 list from Detroit, we're not going to see variation like that, or numbers of I don't know what you want to call it, Golgari value-based decks.
Yeah.
But we do start to see the rise of, like I said, Twin and Affinity, these other decks in the format that kind of eventually peak up once Deathrite Shaman is gone, because like Wild Nacatl before it, every green deck started with this card, or every black deck started with this card, and it just ran the format. It was just too good. So I consider the post-Deathrite Shaman era to be when Modern truly becomes a format with its own unique identity and focus. Like, I agree with everything you said about, like, the format is announced, you have no idea what's going on, you just test, you watch that Pro Tour, you're like, what the hell is this? And it's just a great time, absolutely.
Mm-hmm.
And I also agree with you from a financial standpoint where that was the time to get in, because very shortly thereafter, once Modern widens in scope, it's still coalesced around a smaller number of decks. And prior to the first Modern Master Set, the barrier to entry for the overwhelming majority of the format was just extremely high, and the best way to get into it was to have been playing when the cards in the best decks were in Standard.
Yeah.
Everything took a rocket a few years before Deathrite Shaman banning, which is exactly the era you're talking about, and there was nothing to be had on the cheap. That's it. From top to bottom, it was just a super expensive format. We're talking about the era of like $100 Zen fetches. We're talking about like even the Tron list, everything that Wormcoil Engine is like a $50 or $60 card. Karn Liberated is close to 100. This is Ugin is going to hit in about a year and basically become another $60 to $80 card in Tron. Inkmoth Nexus in the Infect deck is going to cost closer to 40 or 50. Noble Hierarchs are going to jump up from 20 to 40, and this just becomes a very expensive format overall. And it really is just time and what's the right word here? Not attendance, but interest in the format drives finances sky high for this format. And so financially speaking, exactly what you said. For Modern, the best time for finances was right at the beginning because everything was super cheap. If you wanted to get in now, also a good era, but it's taken so much work by WotC to get there. So many master sets, so many reprints to actually make this format financially accessible to people.
Yeah.
Like, I couldn't agree more with what you said, because by the time I'm interested in this format and playtesting and actually going to events, everything is just wholly inaccessible.
Well, and it sucks because Modern was created as like, here's the accessible Eternal format for people. Well, that was great until you had to make a new non-rotating Eternal format because Modern got too expensive, which meant Legacy was just outlandish. Thanks, Pioneer.
Yeah. And so now we're going to backtrack a little bit. And we're going to split here and talk about different formats. I'm going to look at Extended, which is a fantastic format for people who know about it, and for those that don't, it was a non-rotating format. It was a barely rotating format where WotC seemed to rotate it whenever they felt like. The more you dig in on this, it usually happened every 1 to 2 years, and I'll mention that a little bit here. Yeah. But when I started after the second rotation and before the third rotation of the set. So the second rotation was in October of 2002 and lasted for 3 years until October 2005. So this is 3 years. Sometimes we saw a 1 year rotation because WotC felt like whatever.
Yep.
This third rotation was what players refer to as the Moto alignment, whereby the last of the sets not implemented on Moto rotated out of the format. So it became an IPA block forward compared to what it had been before, which was when I started playing Tempest block forward. Now, this is a wide berth for a format, but Extended was unlike any other format we have ever had.
It was so good.
It was a rotational format based on a, quote, legacy, unquote, card pool. So this allowed for the format to see change and evolution every 2 or 3 years, rotating out the oldest blocks, effectively starting the format anew. But in between those rotations, it was a brewer's paradise because you kept adding standard sets on. So when I started in 2002, that was basically IPA block. So I had Onslaught. So I had Tempest to Onslaught. Then Mirrodin block came in. It was Tempest to Mirrodin. Then original Kamigawa, and it was Tempest to Kamigawa. And right after Kamigawa, rotation. So I had all those blocks come in that allowed me to just brew and play. It was great. Anything could do well at any given event. Decks constantly came out of nowhere to take the format by storm, and it was never short on ingenuity. Because of this, though, the format didn't need a ton of policing by WotC and saw 3 ban announcements in this entire period, totaling 11 cards. The format would then go on to see 5 more ban announcements total before retirement, 2 of which I think are pretty obvious. One of them was the Affinity ban, and the other was Sensei's Divining Top.
Card was bad.
Absolutely. The other odds and ends were, like I said, Stoneforge Mystic, Jace the Mind Sculptor, and basically anything from Standard that was just too powerful, they started clipping. I think Thopter Sword combo was clipped, and maybe Dark Depths eventually was clipped out of Extended. Now, I don't think I played the same Extended deck for more than a month because I was a filthy net decker and would build something I liked from the most recent GP Top 8, which was, again, always in flux. And this was a fluid and cheap era in the format that would eventually become the cornerstone of Legacy for years to come. And an example of what I'm talking about when I talk about deck variation is this is the Grand Prix Seattle 2005 Top 8. This happened on March 6th of 2005, and we see Rock, which is just black-green mid-range, Gushatog, Cephalid Life, which is Cephalid Breakfast. If people are playing Legacy, this is the original version. Goblins, Alurin, another Goblins deck. Macy Rock, which I believe is another green-black soup deck. And then Sneaky Go, which is hilarious. It is...
I forgot about that deck.
Yeah, it's Blazing Ritual and Sneak Attack. Now, a month prior to this, in February, we see a top 8 with Alurin, Cephalid Breakfast, the Temporary Solution, which is another twist on... Is this another twist on Rock? No, this is Jeskai Control. Sorry.
Yeah, it's from the Solution back in the day. Yeah.
So Alurin, Cephalid Breakfast, Jeskai, Welder Reanimator, which is an artifact reanimation deck, High Tide, 2 life decks, which you've never seen again, and then Blue-Green Madness. This format, a month apart, is all over the place. So when I say this is a wide format and everything changes, we had a Grand Prix in Boston in February, and then on the opposite side of the U.S. a month later, and the format looked so incredibly different at that event. It is wild. Financially, Extended wasn't a terribly expensive format on the whole. The scarcity of cards combined with few online vendors at the time provided the largest hurdle. Like Card House was the place to do it. Star City was just up and coming. TCG Player was not a thing yet. I think there were still maybe even Brain Burst then. There was,
I think so, yeah.
Modal was like the other place, Magic Online Traders League, which we mentioned, every now and again we bring that up. But from
This was so good.
yeah, from memory though, the most expensive cards were those that were still in standard, as they had demand from multiple sources. And for instance, here is when I was building Dimir Reanimator, and this is Entomb, Exhume, Reanimate, Vampiric Tutor, Chrome Mox. I didn't spend as much per card on Show and Tell, Reanimates, Entombs, or even Vampiric Tutor as I did on the set of Rorik's Bladewing or a Chroma Angel of Wrath. Those were the cards I was reanimating, and every one of those cards individually cost more than a Show and Tell, a Reanimate, an Entomb, or a Vampiric Tutor. That is insane.
The thing about Extended, and you talk about how wide open the metagame is and how rare the ban announcements were, and the reason I love the format is that by design, it allowed for design mistakes in Magic to figure themselves the fuck out.
Yeah.
Like, it was so open because there were infinite archetypes, and a lot of those made their way into Legacy later. And it's funny you mention, like, Aloran and all these others.
Yeah.
I mean, think about how many of those decks are now powerhouses in EDH.
Mm-hmm.
You know, in many ways, I think Extended as it existed was probably the single most influential format on all of Magic in terms of prices and in terms of, like, design. I love the format. I encourage everyone to look into it as much as possible. So many rule changes came out of Extended. Mind's Desire has to be shortcutted now because of it.
Mm-hmm.
Like, it's just, it was awesome.
Oh yeah.
And like you said, your ability to get those decks, like, it was affordable. You could get a tier 1 deck, and sure, there's the argument of, oh, well, I have to buy a new deck every month because the format's so open. No, you don't. You don't have to.
No, not at all. I played Aloran for a really long time, and I played Goblins for a really long time, and those were for funsies. They lasted me for years, basically until they rotated. I'm trying to find now when they banned Affinity in Modern, because there was an Inquest article. Not Modern, sorry, Extended. Because there's an Inquest article from the time in Extended that compared the fastest decks in the format. And I remember this because it has Mirror Enforcer on a bike, just hand-drawn.
Yep.
And it's which one of these is faster. Goblins, Full Power Affinity, I believe, or Blue-Green Manus. And Goblins won. And it
March 2005 was the extended ban for Affinity.
Okay, yeah, which is huge.
Yeah.
So Affinity did not see a ban for a fairly long time in Modern.
Yeah.
Commander saw a ban. Commander had just started in 2005.
Yep.
Woohoo. And you were able to your point, you were able to beat that design mistake with decks that existed in Extended as they existed almost in Standard, but Goblins got like Wasteland. It didn't really play Port a lot. Blue-Green Manus was still the same deck, and those were the fastest decks. They were all vying for that slot. They were all fairly competitive. You didn't just get blown out playing against the Affinity player. Yeah. It gave the ability for people to actually continue playing their cards even after they were banned in Standard, and not feel like they were just overpowering a bunch of people in a different format. It was great. And it's convenient that as we talked about before we started recording, that I picked this era in Extended, and I mentioned it in here. A lot of what you see here in this era of Extended became a pillar of Legacy. The Goblins list is almost the exact same.
Yep.
The Aloran list is almost the exact same. Although, prior to AFR release, AFR brought us Arcarix, the Lich, however you want to pronounce that.
Yeah.
Which changed the list. And it brought us Reanimator. It brought us Cephalid Breakfast, which is just coming back around. Though now it's not reanimating Suture Ghoul we're winning with Thassa's Oracle, but the idea is still the same. It's still the same core engine. Red deck wins. Very similar to what was going on here. I want to say the Storm deck, the High Tide deck in Extended became the High Tide deck in Legacy. Countertop kind of put an end to that one. But there's a lot of this parallel that we see in this era of the format that it builds the foundation of Legacy for the era you're going to talk about, I believe, and then moving on into the future past that. Yeah,
it's really interesting to see that coming now from the point where we're, a few years removed. and we kind of get, okay, how extended influence things. Because at the time, it was just fun.
Yeah.
Like, it was just gas to play that. And, there was a lot of opportunity. And like you said, it laid the foundation for what I consider, I guess, really just the reformation of Legacy, if you want to call it that. It was, so way back in the day, we had Type 1 and Type 1.5. Well, for a very long time, those formats were intertwined. And the ban list was simple. Legacy had cards that were banned, and they were mostly the cards that were banned in Vintage.
Restricted.
Everything
Banned
restricted in Vintage is banned or restricted. Then, in 2004, Legacy kind of became its own thing.
Yeah.
They basically said, hey guys, we're just going to make a whole new ban list for this format and make it fun again. And for a few years, Legacy was great. And I distinctly remember it's in 2008 Legacy. It was both a good format gameplay-wise, and it was a good format financially. So at the time, one of the most expensive cards in the format, there were two. Tarmogoyf, which sounds insane to a lot of you, I'm sure, and Intuition. Those were two of the most expensive cards in the format. I played Dreadstill, which was a standstill variant that used the interaction of Stifle and Phyrexian Dreadnought to just nuke a 12-12 out there and start bashing the face. It was really nice because similar to RTR, similar to the Cons era standards, similar to Extended, there were a ton of viable archetypes. You had Ava Green, which was the suicide blacklist that splashed green for Tarmogoyf, named after the James Bond character. You had Quasi-Spanish Inquisition, which was 8 bargains, so like Cruel and Infernal Bargain and land grants. And this was before like Top and, well, this was right when about Top and Counterbalance started to take things over. People were playing mono-white stacks. Threshold was still Canadian Threshold.
Canadian Thresh.
With Werebear and Tarmogoyf as your threats and maybe a Nimble Mongoose. And Tombstalker. We didn't have lands in the way that we do now, but there were control discs in place, and there was a ton of Stoneforge. But it was a time where Legacy basically cost the same as at that time Modern. You could get a deck for less than $1,000, and it would have like 6 to 8 fetch lands. I remember at the time Force of Will was $50 to $75, and now I still think it's at a healthy price of around $100. But it was just a really cool time because, yet again, you had all of these archetypes that basically suppressed the prices of all but a few cards. And that was your dual lands, which, of course, what's the standard anytime you get into a new format? Everyone tells you, make the mana base. Get the lands. So you started to see that kind of become the thing, but it was a time where I remember you'd go into a store and there'd be duels everywhere and they'd be affordable. And this was also right around the time that EDH started to kind of become a thing. So you didn't have the price spike there yet. But you had all these viable decks and all these financially viable and liquid cards in Legacy. Now, the one exception, obviously, was at this time we were before a reprint of the Onslaught fetches. So they were like $100 to $150. But we had the Zendikar fetches. So guess what everyone ran instead?
The
Zendikar fetches. And it made it just a lot more approachable for people. And it was just a really good time for the format. And you started to see what we see now as the financial norm, and that reserve list cards kind of became the driver. Tarmogoyf, Force of Will, those kind of things obviously mattered, but Intuition was Intuition. And you were going to have to pay for Intuition because it wasn't getting reprinted. Duels were duels. You were going to have to pay for them because they were used in everything, and they weren't getting reprinted. So this is kind of a jumping point where while things are good at this time, it's right before things get financially bad. Where people start to be hardcore priced out of formats, where they just can't be involved with it at all as much as they may want to. And you start to see Magic become more of this luxury collectible rather than something that was just practical in our lives because we were in our 20s and didn't care. And that was, that was to me the last time I remember all of Magic being financially approachable for everyone.
Yeah.
Because, Lotuses at the time weren't tens of thousands, they were like 1 to 2, which was a lot of money.
Oh, yeah,
Don't get me
absolutely.
wrong. You could get them, 2 to 5 realistically for good ones, but it was a lot more approachable. It was something that you could realistically obtain if you grinded enough.
Yep. Yeah.
And it was just a really good time to play Magic. And that's, for me, the one thing I can always say about a format that's good financially and good for gameplay is you need multiple viable archetypes. And I don't mean 3. I mean 6+. It can't be your rock, paper, scissors format.
Yep.
There has to be a lot of variety there. And when you look at the formats that we have now that people are playing and they're like, oh, this is stale, I don't want to do it. Modern has a few viable archetypes. Legacy was dog water for the longest time until they banned DI. It's shaken out a little bit differently, and obviously your Mono White initiative needed to go too, but more on that later. But everything was viable. It's just a good time for everybody. As a vendor, I can buy whatever I want. I'm going to sell it.
Yeah.
As a player, I can play whatever I want. It's viable.
So the reason we dovetailed this was because, like I said, the foundation of this extended era was Legacy.
Yeah.
Or rather, other way around. Foundation of this Legacy format
was the extended prior, and
but
that's when you started to see that bleed.
One of the other things that I want to touch on that might actually be very important to a lot of what you're saying is, with that second rotation that I mentioned that removed Ice Age to Tempest, they also ungrandfathered the duels from Extended. And now people that were playing a lot of those decks have nowhere else to go besides Legacy. So you see a lot of the same thing happen with players moving from Standard to Extended that you see going from Extended to Legacy, where they just port their decks over because they own the cards.
Yep.
Also, at that point in time, you said duels are very approachable. People can be divesting at that point in time, too, from their duels that they had for Extended when they are gone because they don't play a Legacy. There's not a Legacy scene. They don't know about Legacy, what have you. So there's this really interesting kind of like place in time for both Extended and Legacy right here. And they seem to me like they play very well together. They're very much in concert.
Yeah.
And I want to give our listeners an example of what's going on in Legacy at this point in time. In 2007, there are 2 Legacy updates from the ban restricted list. In June of 2007, Flash is banned.
My favorite ban because it came into effect on day 2 of an event.
Yep. Mind Over Matter and Replenisher unbanned. Cool. In September, Scheherazade is banned in both Legacy and Vintage because of shenanigans in Europe about a Storm deck in Game 1 that sideboarded into Quad Fork, Quad Scheherazade in Game 2. They just hard cut that, okay? So that's what happens in Legacy in 2007. In 2008, we see one banning, and this is the only change to the format. And I want you to know this. Legacy, in September 2008, Time Vault is banned. That's what's going on. We move into 2009. There's one item here. In September of 2009, Dream Halls, Entomb, and Metalworker are all unbanned. Entomb, too powerful for the format. Time Vault, not so much.
Yeah.
What is going on in this format? It is insane.
It's so good.
So, to give people a little bit of perspective of what's going on in Legacy. Everything is going on in Legacy. Sheer madness is going on in Legacy. We're all mad.
That deck was really good in Legacy for a while after it ported out of Extended.
Yeah, and I'm not speaking about for that. This is just an era of Legacy I'm not familiar with. I assume the majority of our listeners aren't either, and that should give people a good idea of what was going on in Legacy at the time, which is just whatever.
Yeah.
Okay. Anything else before I move into picks?
Nope, let's do it. You start us off.
Yes, I am. So this week, I'm going to be making a pick ahead of Commander, what is it? Masters? Remasters?
Yes, Commander Masters.
In Hellkite Courser. And this is a card that I just kind of threw on my list, and I was like, oh yeah, I actually played this card. I should have thought about this one. And as of taking my notes last week, Card Kingdom was buying 24 at 280. There were 183 at 490 on TCG Player. And when I finished my notes, Card Kingdom was buying 24 at 280 still, thankfully. And the same number existed on TCG Player. So we're not seeing a whole lot of movement over the weekend, which is perfectly fine because we got Commander Legends and then screaming in Lord of the Rings spoilers, which is perfect. This is what I want. I want people to forget about this card for a little bit. So when we look at Hellkite Courser, for those that don't know, because this is only in Commander Legends, I'll bring up the stocks graph so we can see this at the same time. This is a 6/5 dragon for 4 and double red. It has flying, and when it enters the battlefield, it says, when it ETBs, you may put a commander you own from the command zone onto the battlefield. It gains haste. Return it to the command zone at the beginning of the next end step. So important here is a commander. So if you have partners, you only get one. The commander does gain haste, and then you place it back in the command zone. It does not incur the commander tag. This is just a free cast. So in the format on the whole, what's the playability of this? Honestly, pretty high. This is playable in any deck involving red and a commander that costs an obnoxious amount of mana.
There's a lot of them.
There's a lot, yes.
It could just die 4 times and still cost an obnoxious amount of mana.
Exactly. When we look at the format on the whole, we find this in the 99 of primarily dragons and chonky red decks, which is exactly what we expect, but also in Obeka. And my assumption is that this is just to start the chain because Obeka might have died. Obeka only costs 4. But if you summon it in with Courser, it gets haste, you end the turn, cool. It's Obeka for 6, which you're going to pay anyway, but now you avoid the 8 for another round, right? I guess. I don't play this in Cedrus that has Obeka, but so hard to say.
Yeah.
All this to note, we are picking this ahead of the Dragon reprint. That is why I just slammed this on my list and I want to talk about this. We got the Dragon spoiled. Not a lot happened with this card. When we were looking at the stocks graph, there's a little bit of a bump, but we want to get in now before more people remember, hey, this is coming. Now, looking primarily at the monocolored up to tricolored dragon commanders, we see a lot of the same line. Cast Courser, attack with commander, pass, cast commander the next turn. As oddly, a lot of these dragon commanders cost 7, while Courser costs 6. So you get to just slam your commander twice. It's a neat little line of play where you get to kind of quote unquote combo ETB triggers, combat steps, etc. just by playing the game, which is a really agnostic, straightforward, and approachable plan overall. Where I play this is actually in Karthus, Tyrant of Jund, so I can do exactly what I said. On 6, cast Courser, cast Karthus, everything gets haste, mush you. Next turn, just cast Karthus, everything gets haste, mush you again. And it is choice. Yep. Outside of dragons and things like Akroma, Angel of Fury, we see Courser as an enabler to commanders with a splashy ETB or ability that you want to reuse as often as possible, triggering your commander without incurring the commander tax. That's huge. So we look at Atali, Ilharg the Razeboar, Lord Xander.
Ilharg.
That's where we see this. We want to re-trigger that ability as many times as possible without incurring the commander cost. And there's also a small combo element with Obeka and another one with Graven, where you can set up either to start your combo with Obeka and then end the turn, or with Graven. Hitting Courser off of something like Bolas' Citadel is really nice because you get to spend the 6 life on Courser, cast Graven for free, saves a little bit of mana, and now you're punching somebody for what's Graven's power plus 6?
Yeah.
Graven. 5. So you're just punching somebody for half their commander damage by hitting this off of Bolas' Citadel. There's a lot of options here, and they're all pretty palatable no matter how you look at it. When we take a look at the timeline, things are a little fuzzy, but we're looking mainly at the Commander Legends weeks, which is like 5 months out from now, and that's when we can expect to be able to get out of this at a profit. We are reliant on when people can have in hand their copies of the Dragon. That's really important to us. That's the hype we're going for. Now, this has been selling reliably about 5 copies a day for the last 4 months, which is great to see for a card that hasn't received any additional support from a commander recently. This means, though, that will hit the end of supply within the next 2 months, which could be a wrinkle. This could also accelerate if we get any good support in the Lord of the Rings set, which drops 2 months prior to Commander Legends. So this points to, as I said, a bit of a fuzzy timeline. I think buying in over the next few weeks to a month is safe, and profit can be expected as early as 2 months out if supply does truly bottom out, but otherwise we're looking at 5 months. The one interesting thing I did find, though, is that the CK buy list is extremely fragile when looking at this card. Between writing down my outline and finishing my notes, the CK buy list, which, as I mentioned before, is locked at 280, is now down to actually 250 today. And that's flat like 42-ish% of their market price. That tanked actually down to about $2, which was 33% of the retail. So it is not pegged to anything. It's just wildly fluctuating depending on how Card Kingdom feels about it. So until there's a run on them from the open market, them being Card Kingdom, I don't believe that buy lists are out for this. I truly believe this is a trade binder card or an open market kind of card. I might be proved wrong later on, and this does stabilize on CK, but right now, based on what I was seeing over a small span and then tonight, I really don't think buy lists are out. Reprint equity is another interesting wrinkle. I wouldn't be surprised to see this in Commander Legends. To do that in a limited environment is kind of not the greatest, but I suspect it's really the only place to do it reliably outside of a commander deck. But that also means we need to lean in to the tribal aspect here, because they're not just going to give you Corsair Ur Dragon and then a bunch of like other large red generals and no dragon support. They got to lean in. So it's like questionable about what we're going to get in the rest of that set. If we don't get a reprint, then I don't think we're going to see this anywhere else for a while. Last week, we talked about the upcoming sets in regards to the Herald of War spec and how there are no angels upcoming. There are similarly, I believe, no dinosaurs slated. Sorry, not dinosaurs. There are no dragons slated for anything upcoming. It's dinosaurs. So I like this in that regard. And like I said, we're just kind of holding our breath on Commander Legends. But if it does hit a reprint, I don't think it's going to do too much to us. By quantity, I have my 2 copies for play, but I definitely pick up another like full play set to trade out over time to players on the dragon plan, as well as players who realize this isn't tied to dragons. So if you wanted to go as deep as about a dozen, I think that's a perfectly fine number, but it might take a bit to churn through after the initial dragon hype from the Ur Dragon fizzles a bit. Like I said, it seems like people think this card says like put your dragon commander into play, and that is not the case. And so once people figure out it isn't, then it is a lot more palatable to move at larger quantities later on.
Yeah. I like this card a lot. Being able to get a free commander cast, regardless of whether it impacts the commander text or not, which obviously it doesn't, as a huge upside, but being able to get that without the text is huge. Because this is the kind of thing that, while 6 mana is a lot for competitive games, it's still pretty solid, because I can just drop this for 6 mana, and if my win con is my commander, well, I've just got it for free, or it's an extra cast on the same turn. You know, it makes it really good, and it hits that nice battle cruiser speed too, where you get your really casual, and there is a little bit of upside. Not a ton, but there is some there, and I think that's just really good for the card. I also think that being from Commander Legends, which at the time wasn't really a sought-after set, similar to, Baldur's Gate Commander Legends, like you had your cards that were chase cards that you wanted to hit, but this wasn't one of those cards. This is one of those cards that just kind of got forgotten about and has just been sitting there steadily gaining. So I think it's a big opportunity to potentially do really well there. The other thing that's very interesting about this card is that the foil market price has now dipped below the non-foil price, which is very interesting to me, and that's something that you're seeing more and more with cards from these Legends, Masters, whatever sets.
I don't have it next to me anymore, but I do have a foil from that set that you can still find unsleeved in a 1-row, just by looking top down, because they were atrociously bad foils. They just curled super hard. And to mirror that, the Card Kingdom buy price tonight for Hellkite Courser is $250. The foil is $280. So they are also floating in concert on the buy list of CK.
All right. Mine is a little bit different. I mentioned more on that later when I talked about White Plume Adventurer, and that's my pick.
Yes.
So this one's kind of interesting, and basically the reason I'm picking this is because I look at it as an analog to Deathrite Shaman. So if you look at Deathrite Shaman, you see, January 14 when the ban happens, the card goes from $10 to like $6 on low. And then you go to where the legacy ban is, and yet again, it tanks. The market, let's see, it's early July. We're looking at about a $5 market, and then it goes down to $2.
Yep.
Well, guess what the market on White Plume Adventure is right now? $2. Now, Deathrite, as you may know, has done a decent job of recovering. It's generally in that $5 to $7 range, which is a decent double up. Mm-hmm. I remember when Deathrite got banned in Legacy, I bought all of them that I could for $1. When Mox Opal got banned from Modern, I bought all of them that I could for $25 because these are cards that clearly have play in EDH. You know what White Plume Adventurer has? Clearly play in EDH. It's from a fucking Commander set. Of course it's going to see play there. Now, in terms of quantity timeline, obviously you're looking for an EDH set. So you want some multiple of 1. I'd be comfortable with about 10 because it's $20. That's like another 100 Sarkhan's Unsealings or 10 White Plume Adventures, which is probably going to pay for more than 100 Sarkhan's Unsealings when that pans out and Sarkhan's Unsealing doesn't. But this is also worth noting that this is relatively plane specific. So unless we go back to Dungeons and Dragons, which I hope to God we're not that out of ideas right now, but we probably are, I don't see this being something that we'll necessarily see again. Now, this is something we could see in a similar vein to, the Universes Beyond stuff, where it's here's a version of this card or whatever. That's fine. This card is good. It gives you everything you want in white. It lets you end the game. It lets you draw cards. It ramps. It makes your stuff beefier. And it's Seedborn Muse in white. Like, I understand most people, when they think about this card, think of the top half of the text. Mm-hmm. When it enters the battlefield, you take the initiative. The thing that really makes this shine in EDH is at the beginning of each opponent's upkeep, untap a creature you control. If you've completed a dungeon, untap all creatures you control instead. So this being in a color where it's easily abusable with blink effects or reanimation or anything like that makes it much easier to stomp through the dungeon as quickly as possible, and gives you a huge advantage that you normally don't get in white. This does a lot of things that the color doesn't otherwise have access to, and I know that was kind of the theme for Battle for Baldur's Gate. You had Deep Known Terramancer, you had the Archivist of Ogma, and you have White Plume Adventure. All of them do things that you don't necessarily think of when you think white. Mm-hmm. But White Plume is the one that has a price point that's palatable to get into in volume. Now, in terms of timeline, that one's a little bit tricky. Yeah. So if you take a look at the stocks graph for Deathrite, again, you can see where the banning hit, it tanks, and it takes a little bit of time to get back there. Now, the interesting thing about this is that if you look especially at the modern banning, EDH was in its infancy. Didn't really exist that much. If you take a look at when the legacy banning happened, which was July 2nd, 2018, you see that shortly thereafter, that price corrects in like a year to be almost twice what it was after the banning. So I don't think we're looking too long on this. I think it could be shorter than 12 months even. Because obviously there's some D&D tie-ins, stuff's going a little bit different for them. You've got Baldur's Gate 3 releasing in August. There's a lot of things that could get looks to this card just from the general awareness of Dungeons and Dragons. But worst case scenario, you're looking at 10 to 12 months to double your money, which is, again, well above what you're going to get out of the S&P, well above what you're going to get out of any sort of any sort of like certificate of deposit. It's just a good, I think, pick up 10 to 20 for a low amount. put them in a box, forget about them, maybe take a couple in your trade binder just to even some things out, because they are at a price point where that's kind of palatable.
Yeah.
It's also something that should be pretty easy to pick up from legacy players now, because guess what? They can't play anymore. One of the most affordable decks in the format. So we got to go back to Death and Taxes, which I hate. But I think it's a really good look, and it's something that, much like your pick, hits the competitive side as well as the casual side. It does the whole gamut of people that play EDH, and that just makes it really fun to me.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think it's going to take some time before people want to actually figure out how to best play the dungeon stuff.
Yeah.
And obviously, the initiative and the rest of that suite play well together. And I think one of the things that might be holding this back is the initiative is spread across... Is it all 5 colors, or is it just Abzan? Oh, no, it's Abzan plus red at least. I don't know if there's a blue initiative.
It did have blue because it got banned in Pauper.
Okay.
So it is everywhere.
Yeah, so it's just like, what is the best option for this deck? Is it 5 color dungeons? Is it something like that? And I don't think there's a great general in front of this yet, a great commander in front of this. So
I think it's just a value add to a deck right now.
Yeah.
Which, speaking about financial opportunity, is great, because if we ever get a dungeon commander, probably pretty good.
Yep, exactly. So it's like, that's kind of forward think too. It's just about how this mechanic was created, the dungeon. I'm not even talking about initiative here, the dungeon, and then just not really supported from the bottom up in regards to commander. It just seems to kind of have been left by the side. So you got to look at cards that just provide additional value, and it's White Plume Adventurer does that really well compared to almost all the other initiative cards. I think the green one's pretty decent. The green one on taps, right?
I don't know what the rare one does. I only know what the common one does.
I was thinking about the rare one.
The rare one, I think it's on tap,
Yeah, Under Mountain, whatever it is.
Yeah.
I should know this off the top of my head. Under Mountain Adventurer. When it ETBs, take the initiative. Oh, no, it doesn't untap.
Okay.
But if you've completed a dungeon, you add 6 green mana to your pool instead of 2. So, again, another card that actually works well with completing a dungeon. That plays well with the rest of this kind of suite of cards. So I like these for a look overall. I agree. I think White Plume Adventure is the best one to look at right now because it is just a great value add in Commander. The initiative is not as impactful on your life total as the Monarchy is. The Monarchy gets you killed. Because that's how you got to take it.
Yep.
And the initiative does not. It just triggers in your upkeep and you do your thing.
Yep.
And so for a card like this right now in Commander, I really like the look overall. There's the opportunity that there's a smidge of pressure put on this from Vintage, which is seeing white
still
initiative.
Sees play there. Yep.
So you still have, like, albeit this kind of mothballed format that could be putting a little bit of pressure on this. And now that it's back down at a much more reasonable price, it is going to be a lot easier to move as it gains in time. So if you come in at somewhere between, let's say, 2 and 4, when this moves up to 6 or 7, that's a lot more palatable than the immediate spike to $10 that it was. People kind of see this as a savings and move in from your binder, and it becomes this really affordable option. And right now we're probably getting close to, if not already at peak supply because of that ban, I would think. And so now would be the correct time to move in on this. It's something you talk about a lot. You like looking at cards that are banned or unbanned as targets. Yeah. And not all of them are good looks, but this is
not all of them pan out, but
so you got to figure things out, and I think with this pick in particular, you've definitely done that. I think this is definitely one that has the opportunity to pan out.
Yeah.
So I like it. All right. Anything else before we cut out?
I think it's dog shit that Wasteland is legal in Modern. That's about it.
It's not legal in Modern.
Until Lord of the Rings.
No, it's not. The box topper stuff doesn't change. I thought Blake said.
Did he say it did? I thought it was in the set, not just a box topper.
If it's in the set, then yeah, absolutely. But at the end of the day, I'll put it in Goblins all day long. But if it's not, I don't think it's in the set. I do not believe the box toppers change legality. I think that's what Blake said before he revealed Wasteland.
Okay.
Double check me on that, but get at me in the comments. So,
Yeah, please.
but otherwise, I mean, is Field of Ruin that far off?
Yes.
Okay, fair enough. But for at MtG Cabalcast on Twitter, Facebook, Patreon, and YouTube, I am at Halt I Am Reptar. You are,
And Thirsty Sizzler.
and we'll see you next week.